Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Great to see you all. Thanks for joining us. So it's nice to see a small group. I think I know almost all of you. So you know that we're Arise. We have a dual mission. We provide free representation to asylum seekers here in Pittsburgh, and then we train and mentor folks around the country. So tonight's training is with Veronica Reinhagen, we call her Vero, and me. And the goal really through this series is to try to offer something a little bit different in all of the topics we're addressing. So it's pretty easy to find free trainings for immigration advocates, like introductory trainings. So we're trying to go kind of a step beyond that and give client stories and things that you'll remember, just sharing experiences from our actual caseload. So that's the goal of tonight as we talk about interviewing clients for generally humanitarian immigration relief, but specifically asylum, because that's what we focus on. So two things for you. I'm going to put in the chat a link to a certificate that has all the DOJ requirements if you're seeking accreditation. You just fill in your name, and then I'm going to put in a link to a sample agenda if you're going to do an interview of an asylum seeker, because it gives you the big elements that you're screening for that you need to document through their affidavit. So I'll hand it off to Vera in just a second, but basically we tried to structure this so that you have kind of a working understanding of the things you're going to address with your client as you're interviewing them. That includes the affidavit, it includes evidence, and a lot of other things to think about because these cases are so multifaceted. So we'll go through those big points together, and we'll probably stop pretty frequently since this is a small group, and we can chat a bit. So Vera, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so I have my notes here. So first we have cultural consideration. So before we can begin to gather the facts that we have to think about culture, trauma, gender, and language and how those affect the interview process and plan for it. So some things that may seem small to us can completely shape whether a client feels safe enough to share the important details of their story. Shaking hands. And, after we put shaking hands here, I'm thinking about the fact that we do a lot of this on Zoom. But in any case, a thing to keep in mind is that some cultures, especially depending on their religion or gender or age deference norms, they may not feel comfortable touching or being touched or shaking hands with someone of the opposite sex. Or I should add, maintaining eye contact. This has happened to me where I was with somebody and the entire time they were looking at the wall as I'm looking at them. And if we interpret this as rude or evasive, we can start the relationship off badly. So I've learned that it's better to let the client initiate the physical greeting or just greet them warmly verbally and let them be the ones that initiate that. Um, some trauma survivors are also uncomfortable with an unexpected physical contact, and even something as routine as a handshake may not feel good. So keep that in mind and plan for that. And then finally, we have gender preferences here. Um, a woman or a man who experienced sexual violence may be unable or unwilling to describe what happened to them in detail with somebody of the opposite sex. Um, and that can be like the interviewer and or the interpreter. So that's something to keep in mind. Sometimes the client won't tell you that, but they'll become vague or they may shut down or say they don't remember. Um, Also, maybe LGBTQ cases. Clients may feel unsafe speaking through interpreters that are from their same community or their same country, if they feel the same gossip or cultural stigma from their communities. So don't assume, just ask whether they have preferences regarding the gender of the interviewer or the interpreter. And then finally, here we have listed again, leaving the door open versus closed, which is also applicable if it's in person. Some clients feel safer with the door open because closed rooms can feel intimidating or it can be triggering, especially if they were previously detained or interrogated or abused behind closed doors. But the opposite may be true also. So other clients are terrified, you know, that they will be heard with an open door. And especially if their claims involve domestic violence or gang persecution or political opinion or sexuality, and privacy is essential in those cases. So rather than just deciding for the client, we can simply ask, would you feel more comfortable with the door open or the door closed? And if you're in a Zoom, which happens often, more often than not nowadays, you can simply ask, are you in a private room? Do you feel comfortable speaking? Do you need to close a door? Do you need to move away? And keep that in mind. And then languages. This is my thing. I started this off doing translation and interpretation for asylum cases, so I'm particularly sensitive to these things. We should never assume that fluency is based on nationality when we're looking for an interpreter. Two people from the same country may not even share the same first language. Uh, an example, I used to do a lot of them with Spanish. If a client says that they speak Spanish, they may not actually, Spanish may not be their first language, and it may not be in particular the language that they feel the most comfortable discussing their trauma or something that's legal. They may speak Mixtec or Quechua or Nahuatl or any other indigenous language. Sometimes clients, may nod along just out of politeness or embarrassment. Um, and and it's because there's a language access problem, and it can create inconsistencies and credibility issues down the road. I'll throw a couple of numbers here so you can always keep this in mind. Mexico, for example, recognizes 68 indigenous languages officially, in addition to Spanish. Um, Researchers estimate that there's over 200 of them, but 68, along with Spanish, are officially recognized. In Ecuador, 14 are spoken. Uh, is that Ecuador? Yeah, in Ecuador, it's 14. Um, Clients may technically speak Spanish fluently enough for daily life, but might struggle with subjects that have to do with emotions or trauma or things that are more intimate and layered. Haiti, for example, virtually all Haitians speak Creole as their primary language, and French is also the official language, but estimates suggest that only 5 to 10% of Haitians speak French fluently, especially outside educated or urban populations. So we sometimes assume, like we might ask, what language is Creole and French, and it might be easier at that moment to find a French interpreter but keep these things in mind. Guatemala, 24 languages, um, and two Guatemalan people may both identify as Mayan and still not understand each other linguistically. So these issues can directly affect the quality of the testimony and the evidence that we're gathering. And a client who does not feel safe or respected or understood may not be able to tell their story clearly for us. And I'll throw it back to Jen for the rules of evidence, unless anybody has any question.
Okay, so evidence. Why are we talking about evidence when the topic of this talk is interviewing, right? Well, it's because the evidence comes through your interview of your client. So it would be extremely rare in immigration for your client to come to you and say, okay, here's all my evidence for this case, right? It just doesn't happen. The evidence comes through us explaining what's relevant, asking good questions, and also the client understanding what we're trying to prove. Sometimes clients maybe don't have the capability of understanding because of lack of education or trauma, or even, some cognitive impairment. We've had quite a few clients who have had head trauma. So, to the extent possible, we want to try to help them understand, but sometimes they can't, but we can still gather a lot. So, the rules of evidence do not apply in any kind of strict way in front of USCIS. So what I'm about to explain is unique to USCIS policy. It's very similar to the policies that control an immigration court, but there are a couple of differences. So keep in mind, I'm just talking about CIS and not court work. So if you pull up the USCIS policy manual related to evidence, you'll find that it tells you specifically what you can file. So generally, you can file documentary evidence, which just means paper, right? Or a PDF that you upload if you're going to file online. So it's paper-based documents. It can be also testimonial, right? At the interview, your client interviews for asylum or some other form of relief. They're testifying under oath. One interesting thing to think about too is that for a lot of interviews, you can request that someone else interview in support of your client's claim. Like, for example, a lot of people don't know that about affirmative asylum because generally it's just the applicant that testifies about the story. And then, of course, their derivatives have to be there to answer all of the derivative questions. But I'll give you the most common scenario that I've dealt with for unaccompanied immigrant children. That's a statutory term related to kids generally who cross the southern border by themselves without a parent. So I've represented a number of those kids, and some of them were too little to understand why they were applying for asylum. So I had mom interview for the kid, which actually has worked out very well. And so the way that worked is child, answered a couple questions. The one that comes to mind, he was only 7 when he interviewed. He answered a couple questions. I made sure the officer understood the situation, that mom was fully knowledgeable, and she could give a first-person account of what actually happened, the risk to him, and it was much more reliable than the child. So it's helpful to know because many people don't know that about the affirmative context, that you can have someone else testify. They would just most likely need to be there in person, but it's possible that they would accept testimony on the phone or in some instances, like in the past, through WebEx for an expert witness. So that's the testimonial evidence. And then expert evidence is generally, like in before USCIS, provided through the form of an expert report. So there's 3 types of expert reports that we see in humanitarian immigration. There's medical, usually documenting injuries like FGM, female genital mutilation, or scarring, things of that nature, or psychological evaluations. Those are kind of obvious. And then country conditions reports from experts who explain the unique risks to your client and why they would suffer persecution upon a return home because of their protected characteristics. They're hugely valuable, especially in this environment, just because the government is generally taking the stance that most countries are safe to return home to. It's helpful to almost rebut that presumption by having an expert with impressive credentials weigh in on your case. Um, so thinking about evidence. So Vero has a great story about what we tend to see in terms of clients who are hesitant to even move forward with their case because they think they don't have enough evidence. They think their case isn't strong enough. One thing I'll say is that a lot of people know about hearsay, and they think that they don't have enough evidence because they don't see it as direct evidence. Like no one left them a threatening letter, said they were going to kill them because of a protected characteristic that they had. And that's kind of like the high bar that clients tend to come at this work with. And I think that's exacerbated because of the political landscape right now. So it's helpful to know that a client could come to you and say like, oh, I really don't have much, when in reality they could have a lot. So Vero has a story about that.
So we had a client that came to us, um, and I think she had been in the country for about 3 months or so. And she was young, she was highly educated in political science, and I think she was here visiting some friends that she knew, and she found out she couldn't go back to her country because she was being persecuted. So she was very upset, and she was here on her own, and she told I ended up working on her case, but she said, I don't have anything. Like, I don't have any evidence or anything like that. So, okay, can you get an affidavit from your mom? Her mom wrote an affidavit, but it was very flimsy. It was a strong case, but the evidence was pretty flimsy. And then I don't remember how we said something about like any people that you worked with perhaps can, you know, write something about that. And she's like, oh, I think she ended up getting, she had worked for the United States Security Service in her country, and they had been evacuated and were back in the States, but she had visited these people, and they were sergeants of the United States. What was the department,
Something
Jen?
within the DOS.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and and they wrote. Both of these sergeants wrote letters of support for her, and they were awesome. They said, you know, at the top it said United States Department of Defense, or uh, and um, and they were awesome pieces of evidence that we did not anticipate. And you know, she was teary at the beginning, saying, "I have nothing," or maybe my mother can write something, and that's about it. And that ended up being really strong. So we weren't expecting that.
and her case was approved in 3 days, 3 days after her interview, which is the fastest I've ever heard of. We were actually wondering, was
If
it
it was a
approved? So,
mistake, if
yeah, we
it
were
was a
wondering if it was
mistake.
a mistake for sure. We waited a few weeks to like make to monitor it. But also, there's so much vetting that happens with asylum. It has always been that way since I've done this work, but of course, it's increased the last year and a half. But I was wondering if those letters from her supervisors expedited her vetting because she basically had a security clearance, if not a real security clearance, it was like the equivalent of one. And those letters corroborated that. So, yeah, so she had phenomenal evidence and didn't think that she did at the jump. So, we have to pry and we have to go through some explanation as we interview. In terms of unpermitted evidence, video evidence is not allowed, but you can get creative. So a lot of clients have video evidence, especially with social media. So what you can do is screenshot from a video, and that's documentary evidence. It's just a picture, and then you notate it and you say something to the effect of, this is a screenshot from a video, this is what's depicted in the video, date, who it is, blah, 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 the significance. And then you can offer in that notation, I'm happy to share this video at the interview or the adjudication, whatever. And then related to that, like any photos, you can submit those as evidence. They should just always be notated because I've been informed by a couple of officers that photos are not considered unless they are notated. Like there needs to be a description of why they're relevant, what's happening, etc. And then lastly, foreign language documents. So any foreign language document you're going to submit needs to be accompanied both by a translation and a certificate of translation, or it will be disregarded and you're likely to get a request for evidence, which we call an RFE. Okay, so I'll pause there. Thoughts, comments about evidence?
I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned about parents. Sorry, I'm going through a cold. You mentioned about parents. How about if the parents have never turned themselves into immigration? I have a client that she's 12 and the
Yeah.
parent never turned into immigration.
Yeah,
Can they
so the parent
be?
doesn't have status.
No.
Yeah, and crossed the border illegally, I assume.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in this environment, it's riskier. So back the case that I mentioned, that was during Trump 1.0, and people were not being arrested at asylum offices around the country. That was just a given. So that wasn't happening. Now we know that people are being arrested at asylum offices. That's happening. I don't think it's real frequent. Of course, we all know it's a real problem that we have no access to actual data because this administration doesn't give any sort of statistics or data related to those kind of figures. But we know that's happening. So just I can tell you the way I would handle that is if this child is called for an interview, it's likely that the parent can at least really add to the story, right? So if you think it would help the client, I would tell both the client, because that's who you're ethically obligated to talk to, and the parent, assuming your client like authorizes you, right, to talk to parent. I would sit them down and say, look, there is risk to you. We have no idea how much, um, but we think it'll strengthen the claim if you do testify. So, for your child's sake, thinking legally, I think it would help, but it's your decision whether or not you go and you testify. It's complicated though because your client is the child, right? So, you know, in an ideal world, you would have the child make all of these decisions, right? Like yes or no, you can talk to my parent. Like yes or no, it's worth it to me if they come. But a 12-year-old can't really weigh all of those risks and benefits. But like we can pretty much assume that the child's going to want their parent not to be imprisoned and deported, right? So that's why just practically I think that you lay it out for them both and have them make the decision. Yeah, it's a horrible situation. I do think I do get updates from a lot of other immigration lawyers across the country. I don't think it's super common that people are being picked up at asylum offices. We just know it is happening.
Do they check, in your experience, do they check if the person who's testifying is illegal or not? Do they, I'm pretty sure they check the background.
You mean to determine whether ICE shows up? Is that what you're saying?
Um, who's testifying? Are you
Yeah,
legal?
so they wouldn't necessarily know, like in the situation you just described, they wouldn't necessarily know that the parent's coming. So it kind of, I mean, there's just so much we don't know about ICE's priorities. Um, yeah, but historically, like folks who were here without status, who crossed the southern border illegally, that was not a big deal at the asylum office. There were no ICE arrests. The asylum office did not use that as like a negative discretionary factor, anything like that.
Well, here in Connecticut, the government is very proud to immigrants, so that will help. But yes, there's a case like that, and it's coming up on June 4th.
Yeah, it's so hard. Hmm. Anything else on Jennifer, go ahead.
Yes, so just quickly on the foreign language documents, um, should in general it not be the same person that's signing off as the attorney or accredited rep?
Yes, generally. Yeah, because there's at least the appearance of bias.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, okay, what was the other question I had? Um, no, I should have written it down. Okay, if I think of it, then I'm gonna write it in the chat, the other question that I had.
Sure. Anyone else? Okay, so we'll move on to pre-interview homework that you can do just to make your life easy. Oh, sorry. Tatiana, go ahead. I see your hand now.
Uh, my question was, I just didn't understand. Hi, first of all, hello. My question was when you said that the children who cross the border themselves, how you ended up to get their parents interviewed? Because I assume that if they cross the border themselves, how did you get the parent? Like, was a parent already here, or
Yeah,
how
so for the
did they?
cases I've worked, the vast majority were moms who were already here and left their children with their parents, like mom's parents, and in home
Okay.
country, and then the children came up by themselves and
Okay, because I
reunited.
saw that maybe it was on the phone remotely or something like this. I just didn't, it was not clear.
Yeah, I mean,
That's
in
what
this,
happened. That's what
in,
happened to my client. The mom came and left the child with the parent, and then the child came by herself.
and in this environment, I think they're going to require in-person testimony always. Maybe, God willing, in the next administration, they'll revert back to some more reasonable practices. But right now, I think we should all assume that they're going to make that a requirement.
And I also have another question about the interview in general. If I may ask, like I had an interview with the client from Haiti, and I tried like so many times to understand who was a persecutor,
Hmm.
and I couldn't get a hold of him. Like I'm asking questions. Was it a government? No, it was gangs. But they're connected with government. No, but the gangs are not. So the government doesn't come and threaten you um, themselves. Like someone like send them to me, and I ask the questions, and I see that it's not consistent. But I understand he was hurt somehow, and I try like so many questions to ask and to come from the to get it from the different directions, to look at
Hmm.
from different perspective, and I cannot understand like what happened. So eventually I developed the thought that he's not credible, that someone suggested him, because there was a statement like, these people saw me in the bus, they knew I was in the bus, and they came there, and they said like, because you gave this interview, now you're gonna see the boss, and you were criticizing the government. And I'm like, okay, government is opposing gangs, and gangs are opposing government. Like, how does it all fit together? Like when you have these issues, when you don't trust enough, or like what, I really, I didn't know what to do with it. I just asked him to put his story together in writing with all the timelines there, to see if we can do something with it. But when I met him, it was in the stage of interview already, so I actually couldn't do like anything. I said like, if there is a hearing, if you're in removal proceedings, there might be another shot in the immigration court, but you need to put this together. But I couldn't get to the point where I could understand who threatens him and why he's threatened right now. If it was like if the persecution was caused by the government criticism of his political opinion.
Hmm. So what is your question? Like what do you do if you think a
Like,
client's not credible or
yes, like or so there can be two options. First, he could not communicate very well because we work through the translator, and as
hmm
today the it was mentioned already that not everyone in Haiti speaks French,
Hmm.
and but he claimed he was a professor of political science, so I believed he had to speak good French, and I believed he was able to communicate his thoughts. But what do you do if, for like, if you have like these two options? First, you have doubts whether this client is credible or not, or what is most terrible, if he is credible but he cannot put his story together. Like,
Hmm.
how do you get to the bottom of the problem and get the facts that you need for your asylum application?
Yeah, I'll give you just a couple points to think about because these are so common, these issues that you're talking about. So, thinking about credibility, it's very hard to determine credibility for asylum cases because there are so many barriers between us and the client and them telling their stories. We've talked a little bit about this. There's trauma, there's culture, there's language, there's stress, there's this administration. I could go on and on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know, we talked a little bit about this last time, trauma really jacks up your brain, right? It
Yeah.
just does. It makes this work so hard. So I know for me, just having done this work for a long time, I always have kind of the assumption that people are credible. That's just sort of the bias that I have at this point. Because usually when I've been suspicious of people, it's turned out that they've had corroboration and we've been able to figure it out. So that's
Mm-hmm.
just me personally. But that said, it's very reasonable to have suspicions in a situation like this. So I think that, um, worst case scenario, if you think that they're lying, you should withdraw ethically because we can't help anyone commit misrepresentation or fraud or anything like that. That's worst case scenario. Let's think about like how do you actually help them if you think that they are trying to tell the truth, they're just not doing well telling their story, they're really fragmented in their thinking. I think one of the easiest ways to navigate is to help them, one, avoid contradicting anything they already said or filed. And you can do that in an honest, ethical way. You just help them generalize, right? So if, like you said, this gentleman was already called for an interview, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then I assume if he filed an affidavit, you'd have a copy of that. You could say to him like, look, this is what you swore to already. Like I would review that because if you it was really short.
That
Okay.
much.
Well, maybe that I don't know who was representing him, but maybe that was part of the intent is like they wanted a short affidavit so he wouldn't contradict himself in the interview. Or
He
like
was
you have,
self-represent himself. Like,
okay,
he didn't hire any lawyer at that point when he filed for asylum.
okay. Well,
So
then this is the last piece of advice I'll leave you with, and this works very well with highly traumatized people. Once you get through the story, even if it's a mess, you can usually pull out a couple of points that satisfy the elements and also that are consistent, like that he tells every time he tells you the story. You make a
Mhm.
half-page cheat sheet and you say, these are the relevant points of your story. This is what you should talk about at the interview. That works very well. And that's how we prepare clients.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to homework that you can do before you interview your client, just to streamline the process. Vera will talk about that.
Okay, so we don't want to show up to the interview not knowing anything about this country, especially considering that, geography in school here is not that great. So, research the country conditions before the first interview. Um, get your hands on some don't go crazy before the first interview. I mean, before knowing the whole thing, but have an idea about, get a map, find out where the country is located, basic demographic questions, what languages are spoken, what are the politics of the place. Look at the advisories of the Department of State advisories on the country will tell you what are perhaps some of the major problems in the country to find out, um, so that you know something before going in. You'll become an expert by the time you finish the whole case, but to start somewhere. review the evidence. So, whatever in advance. So, if they have anything, whether that, like Jen said, maybe they have police reports or medical reports, or give them a list of things that if they have, they can give to you in advance. Membership cards, social media screenshots, any reports that they may have filed in their own country. And sometimes a small detail in a document becomes really important later on. For example, in a hospital record, they might mention injuries that they forget to discuss during the interview, and you can get back to that. Or a date in a police report may help anchor the timeline when the client struggles with memory. Um, and also reviewing the documents beforehand helps us ask more focused questions and less repetitive questions, which can reduce the client's stress and help us draft a more robust and accurate affidavit and case. Um, that's all I have. Let me see, did I miss something here? um, have an understanding of the legal elements that you need to prove. Ask a supervising attorney if you don't know, so that you have focused questions on that first interview and you're not all over the place. Um, okay, the next, anybody have any questions about that piece? No? Okay.
Yeah,
Um, is there
I do
somebody?
just, yeah,
Yeah.
Jennifer. I just want to know, with country conditions, how do you make sure that you're careful not to introduce something to them as an idea that they could have been persecuted in some way because you know this information rather than them telling it to you?
So I actually think it's perfectly ethical to introduce an idea to educate your client. So I found that a lot of folks who are newer to this world worry about, imposing their own like theory of the case or ideas onto their client, which I understand completely. That said, being a legal advocate is pretty unique in that we are supposed to be zealous advocates. Like we are to fight for our clients' rights, and part of that is educating our client. So I think the ethical way to do that just generally is you try to get a sense of the client's story, but then you say, based on your research, well, are you at risk because of this factor? And if they say no, open up the door. Say, well, I did some research. It looks like you could be at risk of this. Do you feel comfortable exploring this with me? And I actually think if we don't do that, we are failing and not being zealous. So, yeah, I would say try to get the story first and then educate when you need to.
Can I say something about that? I have a person who came to me and young guy, he went to school for communication. And it was around the time he's from Ecuador. It was about the time that this gang take over a news channel. And when he told me about the his situation and he was drunk and while he was taking um the public transportation and stuff like that. When he told me though about his situation and I researched about when that happened in the news, I connected and I told him like, can you find it? I knew about it and I researched about it, but I wanted him to become familiar with the situation so he can, when he's interviewed, he can
Mhm.
identify himself with what happened around that time of him going to university and studying communication.
Yeah, it's definitely a dance. We don't want to coach in the sense that we're trying to force a legal theory onto someone, but at the same time, we certainly want to educate our clients and help them exercise their rights. It is a dance for sure.
And I wanted him to read about it. so
Yes.
he can like feel it and identify himself, and
And
it will be
advocate for
more.
himself.
Hmm.
Okay, so we can move on to the affidavit writing. So Vera will talk a little bit about that, what that looks like, and the options for the client.
Yeah, the affidavit writing. A lot of people hate the affidavit writing. I love it. It's my favorite part. Um, so there is no single way to prepare an affidavit. Um, Coming from Vista, one of the affidavit initially was a concern. I wasn't sure. Is it mostly the client? Is it us? So the best approach depends on the client's literacy level, the trauma history, the language access, education, and the comfort with writing also. So there are a couple of options. The first one, they write it themselves. Some clients are excellent writers, and we've had our share of people. Um, the client that we were talking about earlier, who had a background in political science, her affidavit was practically immaculate. And so people can feel empowered telling their own story in their own words, and it preserves the client's authentic voice, and it helps clients remember more details because everything is solid there, and they can move on from that piece. Um, Usually we just don't say go and write your affidavit, right? So we give some structure, we provide an outline and some guidance in terms of the number of pages, right? We don't want a 20-page story, a deadline as to, okay, can you do this in the next 2 weeks, and some kind of a format. And then if it's not perfect, then edit, edit, and edit along the way as we interview. We tell them, okay, give us a little bit about, and I think we're going to do more about this at some point, right? Or a little bit of your early life, why you were targeted, what were the major incidents, who did it, um, uh, and then fear about returning and why the police or the authorities can't protect you. Um, We've had people that have produced really good ones. The problem with people maybe just writing their own thing is that they can unintentionally uh, write too much and give too much information because they don't realize what really matters. So a client might write 3 pages describing the poverty or the generalized violence in their country, but only one sentence about the actual persecution. So the other option is to help them write the affidavit. Um, what do I have here? Why we may want to help: literacy level, maybe limited education, maybe the trauma affecting memory and organization, which we have to sort out with them, language barriers, fear, shame in discussing events, and never having told their story chronologically before. So, some clients have incredibly compelling stories, but cannot tell their story in a linear way at first, and they may jump back and forth and skip important things and minimize severe abuse. So our role is not to put words in the client's mouth, but to help them organize and clarify their story. Um, uh, Also, the affidavit should still sound like the client, right? Not like a lawyer wrote it or a law article. So if the affidavit suddenly sounds overly formal or uses vocabulary that the client would never use in a testimony, that can create credibility concerns later. So whether the client drafts it themselves or we work together on it through a couple of interviews and drafts, the goal is always the same, which is a clear, truthful, and organized narrative that supports the legal elements of the case. Okay, so now structure of the affidavit. Jen.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that was really helpful, Bear. I didn't know that affidavits were your favorite. That's nice to know.
I
I wouldn't have
always
guessed
loved
that
I always loved it.
because
But
it's very
maybe
tedious.
I don't know. I love it's maybe because it's like building a story and you start and sometimes it can seem so sloppy and like Tatiana said earlier, like so all over and impossible. And then suddenly it starts taking shape. Um
Yes. And
yeah.
we can be a
I'm,
big part of that.
yeah, I'm with you, Vero. Like,
Yeah,
I like it
I
because
like
when
it.
they talk and they say it all over, and when I put it together at the end, and I asked them, this what you want to bring to court. This is your story. I can relate. So they say, yeah, that's what exactly, and they feel understood. They feel heard.
Mm.
So I
It
like it
also
too.
it also feels less administrative,
Hmm.
right? Because in the process, and we'll talk a little bit afterwards about staying flexible. If you build rapport, if you cover the first couple, the showing up to that first interview informed, having evaluated the evidence, and uh, and you stay flexible there are things that start surfacing that you didn't plan for. So it doesn't feel like you're doing an administrative task, right? And you can pull and discover new little things that are going to make your argument, or perhaps maybe another basis for your case might appear. So yeah,
And
I
that's
love
So it
it.
feels
Yeah.
more like human rights advocacy.
And
and
even
that's
if it's weak, like when they say like I have a person talking to me about voodoo, whatever, and I put it together and she's like, you understand me? I can talk to you. Yeah, it was like, and even if it's weak and probably we know that the system is not gonna recognize it, but for them they are so important. They
Hmm.
feel
Yeah,
heard.
that also the process of going through it makes you as an advocate better for the next one, right? You
Hmm.
become better at putting the story together, but you also become better informed about different aspects of that country or of, refugees in general. So you become better and better as an advocate just by the, you know doing this
Yeah,
exercise with them.
exactly. That's why you say you start learning from other cultures and what they
Right,
do,
right,
like Haiti or these other
right.
countries, and things like yeah,
You're traveling from
yeah,
one country to the next. Yeah.
and they feel like heard, like oh
Hmm.
yeah, you understand me. I can talk to you about it. So yeah, I like
Tatiana, I
it
see
too.
your hand. Go ahead.
yeah, hi. So I have a question. Maybe it's a little bit stupid, but when you write this affidavit, I love writing affidavits and personal statements of the people. However, I struggle when the person doesn't have education, and of course, I can write better, even if I try not to overwhelm the statement with legal terms like a particular social group and stuff, and just to explain what happened. But it's obvious to USCIS officer or immigration judge that the client didn't write it because he has no education, and we put there in the personal statement itself that while I don't have education, I have like several grades of school in Afghanistan or whatever. So, what? How do you sign? Like, how do you make? Do you put something like okay, prepared or written from the words of this person and
Yeah.
You sign it as an attorney. Of course, when I did it for this client for immigration court, I made the client read it with an interpreter, word by word, and he
Hmm.
made the corrections. Well, this is not completely accurate. This is like okay, that he worked on it like twice, so I understand it's like good enough for him to sign. But I didn't put anything there that okay, I wrote it.
Yeah, so a couple things. We have to be very careful. It should absolutely sound like the client. Like in this environment, credibility is a huge concern of the governments. They will deny cases based on negative credibility findings. There's a couple ways to address this. Say the client can't read or write in any language and they don't speak English. Well, then you have the interpreter sign a certificate of verbal interpretation, making it clear that this was done orally, verbally, right? And not in writing. So that is a little bit self-explanatory. You cover that base.
Yeah.
If you have a client, similarly, like can't read or write and maybe is very unsophisticated, there have been many times where I've told the client, look, I think that we should disclose that you talked to your lawyer and me, and I typed out what you told me. So we put it in very simple language disclosing that.
Mhm.
But for many of our clients, many of them can read or write, and then they actually read, like to verify the final copy of the affidavit, in which case I
Mhm.
don't think it's necessary. But we should just be very careful. Like it should come from the client that we helped them. It should not come from sort of like a statement from us.
Yeah, well, obviously. So,
Yes.
but if preparer prepared this affidavit, personal statement of the client, and just signed there, and then the client signed, would it be okay? It would still be considered
No. No. So
client
the
affidavit?
preparer is for the application and the filing in general. You should not sign like related to the affidavit. What you should do is what I explained. Like if you
Yeah,
think
that
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 it
is
could come
what.
off funny, just ask the client, look, can I just disclose in this that you talked to me and I wrote down what you told me? And then just make sure they verify everything and sign it. After they always need to put in that little statement, I swear under penalty of perjury, blah, blah, blah. But
Mhm.
yeah, you
But it
should not sign it because that would raise immediate red flags.
Yeah, but it also not completely true because when he didn't tell me this, like
Well,
I
then you
wrote
should
it there
never
and he
include that.
verified it later. Like he read it and he said like, yeah, that's what I meant. That's what I meant. But it's not exactly his words. It's just how we perceive the words based on our knowledge and based on prior research of country conditions, as we discussed a couple of minutes earlier. So it's my perception on so this like I'm struggling to understand this balance if the client cannot pull the story together.
Well, then you have to back off because ethically you don't want to cross the line. So I think it's one thing if you want to take the time to educate your client, right? Have them read, have them learn, have them come back to you and be in a position where they can actually tell you what the story is. If they cannot, we cannot put that in writing. We cannot make up the story for them, even if it's true.
Understood.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So that's a good segue into like the general structure of affidavits. So they vary depending on the case type, but generally you want a little bit about their early life, just a tiny bit, a sentence or two, short paragraph, just so they present as a human being. And then you want the legally relevant facts. So we want to keep that short and simple. With this administration, adjudication timeframes are really condensed. So for asylum cases, we try to keep our affidavits down to about 3 to 4 pages. That's way shorter than I used to do. I used to be way more detailed because it was a very different environment. But pretty much every expert will tell you in this environment to keep things short because that actually puts your client at an advantage. And then lastly, equities. So asylum is discretionary, which means we are incentivized to give the government good things about our client, right? Things that pull at the asylum officer's heartstrings, achievements, those kinds of things. So you could put that in passing at the end of the affidavit, like their dreams and goals for here in the United States, if assuming they're positive, which they pretty much always are for our clients. A couple of general tips. We talked about keeping the client's voice, super important. Keep it short and relevant. That I really can't overstate that because I think there's a tendency to put in too many details, and that's always a risk because clients tend to contradict themselves because of the nature of the traumatic past experiences that force them out of their country. Do not set them up to contradict themselves, right? So this is where skilled advocacy involves generalizing facts, helping your client generalize a little bit. Of course, we always want to stick to the truth, but if they say summer of 1995 in one interview describing an incident, and then they say winter of 2000, right? You need to discuss that with them. Like you can tell them it's fine you don't remember a date, but don't guess. So write the affidavit with them with that in mind and educate them about how that will backfire for them because that's part of our role as an advocate. And then lastly, in terms of just general tips, there are a lot of different ways to interact with your client. So a lot of lawyers are pretty individualistic, I would say, and they like to have high control over interviews. I'm kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. There's good reasons to have high control because then you ensure, well, you don't ensure accuracy, but you're more likely to get accurate information if you're the one controlling everything, whether that's the interpreter, the structure of the interview, the outline, you name it. But there are real benefits kind of on the other end of the spectrum to involving other people in the client's life. So I'll give you an example. We have a number of clients who have almost like friendly neighborhood advocates helping them out. Just wonderful people who want to serve, just know the hardships our clients go through, and they're around to help out. And so sometimes our clients will say like, hey, can this person, this advocate of mine, be involved in my case? I usually always welcome that until I have a reason not to. And so I'll give you one reason why I do. Last year, we had a family from Afghanistan enter. The end of 2024, we filed for asylum for them at the beginning of 25. And so during the course of that case, this family advocate, lovely woman here in Pittsburgh, she mentioned to me that the husband and wife, the mom and dad, were first cousins. Very relevant to the case because that marriage is not acknowledged in Pennsylvania under Pennsylvania law, which means that they could not be derivatives of each other's applications for asylum purposes. So we had to file for them separately. Now, if she had not told me, I would not have asked, are you first cousins? Are you related? Like, I know that happens in other parts of the world. I would have asked the polygamy questions, right? Because we all know to do that for Afghan cases. But I would not have thought of this particular question. So the point is, other people can really add a lot of value and tell you things that you might not otherwise know or think to ask because there's just so much ground to cover. Okay, so I'll switch back to Vero to talk about tips from a mental health perspective.
Okay. I'll try not to make this too long. So trauma survivors often feel safer when they know what to expect. And that's not only with trauma survivors, but also anybody that needs to navigate immigration, right? I like to tell them at the beginning of the meeting how we're going to work together, that how long each meeting is going to be, and what we're going to be meeting for. As a personal thing that I do, I have a day during the week that I tell my client, I will follow up with you on Monday and let you know what's next, what I need. So they know that they can expect to hear from me, and it feels like I'm walking the case week by week, and they know what to expect. If I set up a meeting with them, I'll say to them, okay, we're going to meet and we're going to talk about these specific things. This way, they can plan for it. They can mentally be prepared to tackle whatever question may come their way. And this reduces anxiety. It builds trust. And it also gives them a sense of control, which is important when you're dealing with people that have gone through trauma. let me see what other thing I have here. I also tell them that that I'm not expecting a perfect chronological narrative from the jump, that it might take 2 or 3 meetings to get the whole story. Um, and that first meeting is just the beginning of the story. It's not the final version, and we'll work through it together. Um, then what else we have? It'll take a couple of times defining the roles. We, the advocates, work for the client. Sometimes clients come from countries where authority figures are dangerous or corrupt, and they don't, their trust issues, they don't immediately understand the scope of a role. They may assume that we're connected somehow to the immigration system. So it's personally, it's something that I do is, reassure them that I work for them. I work for you, and I am your advocate. My job is to help you present your case as clearly and truthfully as possible. Giving clients choices and centering them throughout the whole process helps them restore that sense of agency that the trauma has taken away. So also during the interview, if avoid a script, use an outline instead, stay flexible, allow clients to have a degree of control over the narrative and the important and the highlights of their story, as long as they don't go talking, that can happen too. But you'll get a sense of that on the first interview. And if that's the case, then that's when you can say, okay, next time we meet, we'll talk about this thing, and you can focus more. At any time of the interview, you can tell them they can ask for water, they can ask for a break or stop. It gives them, it reduces the feelings of helplessness. It gives them emotional control, and it prevents them from feeling overwhelmed and shutting down. And then the questions keep the pace slow. Remember that silence is not always resistance. Sometimes they need time to recall the experiences. When people are recalling traumatic memories, the processing slows down significantly. And if we rush to fill that void or that silence, we may interrupt that process from surfacing and the memories from surfacing. So short and open-ended questions. For example, what happened next? Can you tell me more about that? How did you react? What were you afraid would happen to you if? Complex and multi-part questions can confuse clients and interpreters, and it starts getting really convoluted. So keep your questions short. For example, instead of saying, when the police came after the second incident, did your husband leave before or after they threatened you and your children? Right? Break that down into 2 or 3 questions. And then ask about the hard topics in a direct way where appropriate. Sometimes advocates become so uncomfortable discussing trauma that they may become vague with the nature of their questions. I have a question here. Okay, so, and if sexual violence is legally relevant, indirect language can actually confuse the client. So, for example, an indirect question, did anything inappropriate happen? Right? Inappropriate is very subjective. Direct but respectful. Did anyone ever touch you sexually against your will? Were you ever raped or sexually assaulted? Um, and sometimes direct questions can feel safer because the client doesn't have to guess what we're asking. Um, so the key is, being calm, respectful, and not clinical and interrogative either. So even when we do everything thoughtfully, avoidance is still going to happen with trauma interviews, and it's not dishonesty. It's just a response to trauma that is super common. So now Jen's going to talk about avoidance.
Super helpful, Vera. I like your example of the long question. I've heard so many lawyers ask questions like that, and it's really frustrating because it's very counterproductive.
And
So it's
I've
a
been
great
and I've been
example.
on the interpreter side
Oh,
with that.
yeah, it's very
And
frustrating.
you're trying to keep the question in your head, and it's difficult, and it's difficult for the client. So
Hmm.
I have a question
Sure.
about when they went through all that and they come over here and somebody took advantage of them, said that they're gonna do this and that for them, but they stole their money and they come to you like what happened in their country and right here. But they come with questions and how you can like make them feel safe. I mean, I try, but how you handle that?
Well, I mean, I think as legal advocates, we can screen them for eligibility, like for a U visa, for a T visa, and possibly any other form of relief they'd be eligible for. You can give kind of a know your rights, um, in terms of reporting crime. But it's really tough because especially in this environment, like we can't give any sort of assurance about safety, right? So it's so hard because we want to do more than we can actually do. I don't know if you
Yeah,
have
but
anything to add, Vero.
I think that, if you're honest all the time, and we do that with our clients when things in this climate with things that might be happening, um, then you try to minimize bad things from happening to them, and that's all you can do. I mean, you build trust. You hope that they understand that you're cheering for them and advocating for them, and that you're going to give them information as it happens. I mean, we work within this messed up system, so that's all we can do, unfortunately, is be honest and also be quick to keep them up to date, which is one of the reasons why I have a set date, that they know that they're going to hear from me, and they're not waiting to find out where's this going. And so from one week to the next, okay, this part is done, the next thing we're working is on this, and now this changed, and it may or may not change for you. And that's all you can do, is just be a support system of trust, and they feel safe with whatever you tell them. That's all we can do.
I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's so hard, Yahaira. We always want to help more than we can, and our clients suffer so much. But I think it is also important to remember like the limitations for us so that we don't take on too much or overpromise or any of those things that can be kind of dangerous. But it's hard. It's hard every day. So I feel for you. Okay, a couple quick points on avoidance because avoidance is one of the most common symptoms of PTSD that we see in this line of work. So there's kind of two ways it manifests in our work. One is avoiding us entirely, like avoiding our phone calls, our text messages, reminding them of appointments, showing up, that kind of stuff, like physical avoidance. And then there's the topical avoidance as we're interviewing them if they don't want to talk about certain things, certain traumatic incidents. So a few things. How can you deal with that? Circle back to it later. Or if the client, like if you think the client's up for it, ask the same question twice in a row. That's okay. we're trying to help them. We're trying to pull out the legally relevant points. You can address it directly and say, if you're noticing like a pattern, hey, I notice you don't seem to respond directly to these questions, XYZ. You can ask them if they want a break. You can also, and this is a big one, you can explain why you're asking the questions. If it's a more educated client, that's more helpful. If it's a client who doesn't have as much education, it's probably not as useful. You can also, I do this all the time, apologize. I tell people, I'm so sorry. Like we just met. I'm asking you all of these invasive questions. I'm sorry I have to do this. The system requires it, and I just want to help. Those kind of disclaimers. And this kind of, it depends on your personality and the way that you approach other people. Whatever tools work for you, use them. Let's see. The last like point on avoidance, and we can talk about this more when we have ethics chats. We have 2 sessions on ethics, but if avoidance gets so bad that you're at the point where your client is just not responding to you, you can ethically withdraw your representation. So we can table that for when we chat about ethics, but it is helpful to know because it can be really stressful for us if we're on a deadline and our client is not responding, even if it is really compelling in a sympathetic situation because of PTSD. Okay, so back to you, Vera. I know you have a story on this topic.
LD avoidance. So we had a client that I worked with that whenever I would ask her questions about, she didn't talk much about what was going on. She was from Afghanistan. And every time she would not say much about her fear there. And so I asked her flat out. And when I started asking her questions, the way she would react was very like she would have this smirk, like almost laughing at me, like, well, are you afraid that something might happen to you? Huh. Well, yeah, right? Like that
Like you're
kind of,
stupid.
yeah, yeah. And well, do you th what happens to other people? And she's like, they get killed. What do you think is going to happen to you? They're going to kill me. And and this was what Jen was saying. This is a way, this is avoidance, right? She wouldn't talk about it. When I asked the questions, she kind of deflected and made me sound like I was asking her a dumb question, which we can understand, but then the problem becomes that if she did something like the concern became for me, if she did this during an interview, it would not look good. Um, in these cases, this could be a response to her PTSD, and this is, where we would have gotten a psych evaluation that could kind of protect us from this coming across as a credibility issue or something like that, the way she reacted, or even offending somebody, right? Like I was offended. She made me sound like I was an idiot asking her these questions. So, yeah, so that's my story about the S case. Um,
How do you handle it? Like,
um, yeah, I knew where she was coming from. I mean, she was, she was from Afghanistan. So clearly, yes, uh, they get killed. So I knew that this was true, but to Jen's point, I would remind her why I was asking her the question. And I would say, I know what goes on there. Because she would say, well, of course. Well, of course, I know this, right? We work with clients from this country. I know what happens there. But the asylum officer might not. And so it is important that you you can speak to this and that you can speak to it in a way that informs and not offends the asylum officer, preferably. So yeah, so letting them know why today I had a client back and forth. I had asked information about, on the I-589, questions about her schooling like 3 times. And she put the year and she wouldn't put the month. And then I said, I'm sorry that I'm sounding so prescriptive about this. But if your form is incomplete, your claim can be denied because your form is not complete. So I
Hmm.
need these dates. So please do not send them back with yet one more school, but not giving me the dates. So telling them why, right? Well, they'll deny your claim. You don't want to put it, they'll deny it, right? It's not complete. So, yeah. And then the final point that I have here is to remain open and flexible to the unexpected, um, but stay grounded in your preparation, right? So, what we think the interview will look like, oh, the process often changes along the way. And we have to be prepared for that. Um, we begin listening to the client and and we keep listening and discovering new things. And yeah, we need to frame the case and it has to be over at some point, but we need to be flexible. Um, our role is to adjust without losing sight of the legal framework that we still need to build. So, at the same time, we need to clarify timelines and document carefully and avoid forcing the client's narrative into an artificial structure. If we can balance the structure with of developing the affidavit with flexibility, then we're more likely to produce affidavits that are legally effective and faithful to the client's lived experience. So,
Great. Well, any closing thoughts, comments, questions? Go ahead, Jennifer.
Okay, so once you do file, how often do you still check in with the client if you're going to continue to represent them? Because that could be a long time. Do you keep checking in?
So it's a very complicated answer to your question, but really it hinges on what you agreed to from the jump. So we have different types of agreements with clients just because of the chaos we've been dealing with. But my favorite way to do this right now is to sign a retainer and say, we will represent you, we will file the whole case, and we will be on the hook for 1 year. At that point, we will have to reevaluate if we can continue taking your case. So in that kind of scenario, what I would do is I would file the case and then we generally prepare them for the interview. We give them the half-page cheat sheet I mentioned. We do at least one moot with them and then we monitor it. And I just always tell them, reach out with any questions. We're always available. So I love what Vera said about how she has like a regular check-in with clients. I personally don't do that. But my hope is that I build up enough rapport with clients that they know they can come back and ask me if something arises.
Yeah, that's
Right.
what I do. I leave the door open, say, you have any questions? And I said, give me 72 hours to get back to you,
Mhm.
especially if it's a Friday.
Okay, so I'm new to all of this. My husband's a physician, and when you transfer to a new doctor, then your file, gets all transferred. What happens if you transfer from an attorney to a new representative? Do they share that information with you, and do you use information that they gathered, like from an interview?
So it depends on the ethical rules of the state. So sometimes attorneys can withhold components of a file or the entire file if the client didn't pay their fees. So that would be a reason when you can't get your file. Of course, we're in the nonprofit world. We don't charge any fees. All of our work is pro bono. What I will say is practically, sometimes it's hard to get information from other lawyers and advocates. So a lot of times I rely on FOIA requests, which is where you get the record from the government itself. It's not always completely reliable. Sometimes it's heavily redacted, but it's better than nothing.
Okay. And then is there any specific type of evidence that you would use or not use depending on the circuit that you're filing in?
Oh, yeah.
And then how
So,
do I know, depending on what, because I'm in Arizona, so I'm in the Ninth Circuit, I think.
good
How do
one.
I know? I how do I know what is good to use? Where do I find that?
Yeah, so the Ninth Circuit is generally really good with immigration law. So I would say the circuit case law, it affects the legal requirements. So there's different analysis and legal requirements across the country, depending on all of the appeals that have risen to the level of the circuits, and then the different analysis that these courts have spewed out over the years. So it's more about like the legal requirements, and then of course evidence flows from that. I think so. In an ideal world, you would have a legal database where you could do research. Those are very expensive. In the past, before this field was just completely overwhelmed, which it is now, nonprofits would publish digests giving explanations of like, this is the state of the law in particular social groups based on domestic violence in the Ninth Circuit. Here's your cases, here's your analysis. Awesome. That's so helpful. That's not really in existence anymore because it's just so crazy right now. So there's not really an easy answer to your question other than like for us, our clients interview in the Fourth Circuit, which is great. Like we become very familiar with Fourth Circuit case law. There's a particular nonprofit that still is updating a little bit. It's called Amica. They're down in DC. So I follow them. The ALA listserv out of Washington, DC is the best in the country, I think. So I'm always updated with case law changes. So it's really just a matter of plugging into like your local infrastructure. I'm sorry, this is a really annoying, vague answer to your question, but there's really not like a clear-cut response, unfortunately.
Okay.
You kind of have to
Okay.
find like the good advocates, the savvy ones, and do what they do.
hmm hmm Yeah, and I'm volunteering with a group out of Flagstaff. I'm in a small town in northern Arizona, and really, North Phoenix, there's no immigration attorneys, and she's the only accredited representative
Yeah,
for
there's
all
so
of
many
northern Arizona.
deserts.
Yeah,
Yeah,
which is part of why I'm training to do this.
that's awesome. Well, and the Ninth Circuit is good, and there's a lot of wonderful orgs within it. So I'm sure you can connect, just probably not local to you,
Yeah.
but relevant to your circuit.
Mhm.
This question is irrelevant, but since you guys talking about the circuit, like if it's true that Puerto Rico has a different um federal laws when it comes about immigration, do you hear about that?
No, I don't know anything about that.
Okay.
Anyone else? All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Farah. I enjoyed your stories. And we'll see you all. I think our next one is in June. So hopefully we'll see you all then.
June
Have a great
Thank
night,
7th.
you
everybody.
so much. Thank you
Thank
guys.
you.
Thanks for
you.
Good
coming.
night.
Good night.
Bye.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Thanks.